Hi guys, and welcome back to day 24 of Inktober. Today is a little one, and this one I actually ended up letting it be a lot sketchier and loose, and I'm honestly a little surprised that I like it as much as I do, and I actually do really like this one. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the ones that I go in letting it be really loose and kind of stream of consciousness where I just build it up and I add elements that I was thinking about on the spot, thinking it would look good. Usually those don't always end up, they almost never end up something that I really, really like. Usually it's something that I like it because I learned from it, or I feel like I was able to experiment and I can take that into a more controlled piece. But for me, I'm just not very good at knowing kind of the limit between a really good looking loose piece and kind of a hot mess. So most of my stuff ends up being on that side of it where it just gets really muddled and kind of too far gone. But this one I did actually really like. I like this one a lot. I started out with a sketch, and her hair is actually very, very different from how I normally like to draw hair. So I think that's kind of the point where it started going very different from what I may have planned. And from the beginning, I didn't have a hugely specific plan for this, but that in and of itself, when I started inking it and I got it done, I was looking at it and the hair just kind of felt not like something that I necessarily would have created or drawn, because when I draw hair, I really actually prefer it when the ends, when everything just kind of seamlessly groups back into itself. So I don't really tend to like to draw these like tendrils where they go off and they do these little spirally things like how I did in this piece. I like everything to be very like together and look like it all has a place, and I like to focus more on it having like an overall shape and design rather than having these like loose pieces. So when I did this one, that in and of itself seemed very out of character for me, because I really don't tend to prefer liking those, and when I accidentally put them in my pieces, I usually end up disliking that specific piece of hair. But anyways, I was gonna give it a try, and I was gonna let it be something that was different and looser, and while I was doing the ink work, I was even letting the brush break where it would start to show the texture of the paper because there wasn't quite enough ink on it. And I was actually kind of encouraging that, whereas up until this point, all the pieces that I did brush and ink with, I wanted to make sure that it was getting really smooth strokes. I would go back over anything that kind of broke like that to make sure that things were crisp and clean. And this one, I was just kind of letting the media do what it wanted. I was letting it crackle, and I was letting little ink lines end up around it. I was intentionally adding areas where it gave it a little bit of edge to it. So yeah, overall it was actually really fun to work in that way, because it was really loose from yesterday's piece where it was very specific and all the lines had to be in the spot that they were in. And it's just kind of nice to have variety in the method and what I want to have done with the piece. But as I did that, after I got the hair done and the line work and everything, I was looking at it, and there were parts of her hair that I really loved. I loved the like main twist that was coming off and the general shape around her head. I liked that it looked like this pulled back hairdo. But there was a lot of lines that ended up happening behind it that were a lot more distracting to that core shape, where it was kind of taking it away from it. So that's where I started deciding that I wanted to have the background really dark at the top and then kind of taper out a little bit, like how I shaded around her neck with a little bit of this like rough, not even cross hatching, but it was just this really rough like strokes of lines that built up, creating this shadow under her jaw. And I thought about how I wanted to be able to emulate that a little bit in the background, where it would start darker and then kind of hatch down into it. And so what I did was I started going over some of the locks of hair that I wanted to recede farther in the background, so it would look like it's more in shadow and just fading back. So it would take the emphasis off of those and put the emphasis back a little bit more on the actual profile of her hair that I wanted. And I actually really liked that effect, and I liked that look. And as I was working on it, I started adding more and more. I added more layers. I added a little bit more darkness on top of all of her hair as it was floating down, so that it was creating more of this darkness above her as well, rather than just this blackness in the background coming down. So I wanted it to blend in with her, and it was starting to mesh with the rest of the picture in a way that I originally didn't think about. But I ended up taking it a lot farther than that, because as I was adding this darkness that was fading down and starting to cover her a little bit, I was really actually liking the way that it was looking, and I liked how it looked like she was in an environment rather than at the beginning where it looked like she was just kind of posing for a portrait. There was no environment, there was no setting, there wasn't anything that she was interacting with or being a part of. And as I was adding this shadow coming down, it started to feel a little bit more like she was in a place, and I wanted to emphasize that. I wanted to build that up more so that it did feel like there was more going on around her, and that's something that a lot of my pieces don't really have as much of. I tend to focus more on the design of it a little bit more and just the overall composition, and I don't always include something that's more atmospheric like this or a setting that she's in. So I was really excited about that prospect, about being able to bring something in like that, especially something that I could do in a looser way with the values and this ink wash, rather than something that would have been a lot more time consuming at the beginning, which I am all for, and I think that I'd really like to do another piece that's a lot more refined and does have a background, but this one just ended up being that it was really enjoyable to be able to dive in, to start creating an environment and an atmosphere and a mood right away with the ink wash, and I didn't have to be really timid with the line work or being as thought out necessarily. Not that there's anything wrong with being thought out. I will always be a proponent for thinking out your pieces, but it was just nice to be able to start working on that without really having any hang-ups. But while I was letting a lot of these elements be a lot looser and more free form, free thought, consciousness, just getting it down and working on it, one thing that I did want to make sure was very controlled was the values. I wanted to make sure that where I was putting the values and what they were doing was very thought out and very controlled. And I think that that was probably the big difference between me liking this piece and not liking this piece, because if everything's just kind of left to be loose and really rough, that's when my pieces start to go really downhill. And I think the value is a big thing, because when I'm working on loose things like this, I think I tend to get really muddy values where I tend to add too many layers and too many shadows and just too much stuff, so that in the end it all becomes very homogeneous. So this one I wanted to really focus on making sure that the values were where I wanted it to be and they were staying the value that I intended. So I made sure that it was a light figure on a dark background, so the darkness was all in the background and the values on her were much lighter. And I did her clothing and her hair a very slight darker value than her skin, so it all just kind of had this progression of tears where it came forward and she was popping out off of the background, and it was very controlled. And I think that, like I said, that was a huge difference between me going kind of off the rails with this piece and me being able to actually like it and feeling like it was successful. And this is one of my favorite parts. I don't know if it's necessarily well executed, but I loved going in and adding these, like, I kind of was imagining the I guess you call them branches, off of a weeping willow, and those are just the most beautiful trees I have ever seen. I love trees, but weeping willows are gorgeous, but they have these really long, thin branches, I guess, and with these little leaves on it, so I wanted to show those, and I wanted it to look like she was kind of in this swampy, marshy, plant-filled area, so having these like tendrils of plants coming down and touching her and covering parts of her face, I thought that that really helped ground her into the environment that I was putting her in, and it made it look a little bit spookier. I liked that it was overlapping her face because it did add a little bit of mystery to it, and it wasn't some pristine environment where she was perfectly visible and then there was an environment she was interacting with it. So I am pretty happy with how that idea ended up being. I think that in the future I would like to do something similar to this, but one that I had that intended at the beginning so I could incorporate it better and be more thought out about it, and the placement of the branches I think I could have done better with. So overall I just feel like in the future I could take this idea, make it a lot more successful, but for this one I really do like the effect that it does have on this piece. And this is where I decided that I wanted to try that washing off effect that I talked about in one of my past videos. And I didn't think it necessarily needed it for this piece, but I thought that the subject matter and the overall look would look kind of cool, and it might have a cool effect where it would have this more washed out, faded, aged look. So I just got a tin full of water and I just very lightly rubbed a little bit at the ink, and I took a little really frayed brush and just very carefully brushed at it. And then I just patted it dry with a towel and kind of taped it down while I heat gunned it to death till it just was super dry. But in the end, I think it didn't make like any difference at all, and I think that I'm starting to realize that I've been using the same water to rinse off my pens for both my waterproof ink as well as my water-soluble ink. So I think that probably all the washes that I've been using have had some element of waterproofness to them. So I think I need to make sure that I'm using different little containers for my waterproof water as opposed to my water-soluble water from now on. But that is everything for today's Inktober, and I am so excited about tomorrow's idea because they have a lot of these like elements that I want to put into it and symbolism and stuff. So I'm really excited to move on and do another piece after this one. But I am actually really happy with her. I like the overall atmosphere that this one had, and I liked working on it. That was a big deal, is that it was just really fun to work on her and see where it took me. But yeah, as usual, I gotta give a shout out. She is available, so the original of this one is at my shop. So if you'd like to own an original, she's there. She's nice and little and very, very small. But yeah, that's it for everything for today. Yeah, so if you haven't subscribed yet and you'd like to be, please subscribe, and you can see me tomorrow for the next Inktober, day 25.